My name is Dave Nave. Russell Ackoff brought new insights into managing the interactions between the parts of a company rather than managing the behavior of each part individually. He called this approach systems thinking, and his insights are a tremendous contribution to business and society. On behalf of the Deming Cooperative, we are pleased to make these videos available to you for your continued learning.
There was a whole issue of Business Week devoted to the question, who owns the corporation? It was a fascinating debate between two groups of CEOs, and the one group said it's not the shareholders. It said the shareholders invest money in the corporation, and therefore they're treated as owners because what they invest has value. But they said if we use that criterion, there are others who invest something a lot more and a lot more valuable. There is only one resource, they said, that is not renewable. Only one, and it's not money. You lose money, you can get it back again. Time. And so they asked the question, who invests the most time in a corporation? Employees. So they argued that if there is such a thing as ownership, it has to be the owners or the employees. The stockholders are investors, and a return on their investment is a requirement, not an objective, because if they are not satisfied, you won't have the capital with which to operate. So just as profit became like oxygen to a person, necessary for existence, but not the reason for it, so similarly here, the return on investment becomes a requirement, not the objective. What is the objective of a community? Now, the interesting thing is we got a word for it, but there are very few people that know what this means. The word is development. The objective of a community is the development of its stakeholders, its members, its parts, and of the larger system of which it's a part. Now, unfortunately, in corporate circles, growth and development are used as synonyms. I don't know whether Boeing has a department, like many corporations do, called Corporate Growth and Development, or Corporate Planning and Development. It's usually a department with some function plus development. If you look at those departments, as I have over time, you find out what they're about. Do you know what they really do all the time? They're about acquisition, joint ventures, and mergers. That's growth. You see, we confuse development and growth. They are entirely different things. A cemetery grows, it doesn't develop. A rubbish heap grows, it doesn't develop. Einstein continued to develop long after he stopped growing. They're not the same thing. You can grow without developing, you can develop without growing. What is development? Development is an increase in the desire and ability to satisfy your own needs and desires and those of others. Development is an increase in competence. Now let me get this. We got some of this up here. I've been through all this. You've got this down. This is the enterprise as a community. And now we come to development. A community has another characteristic that differs entirely from an organism. See, an organism is centrally controlled by the brain. So the brain of the firm was about the executive function in a corporation. But a community is very different. Who puts people into a position of authority in a corporation? So if you're a manager and you have some authority, who gave you the job you have? Your boss. Authority flows down, right? In a community, who gave the mayor the authority to operate for the city? Below. A community is a lowerarchy, not a hierarchy. It completely reverses the flow of authority and resources. In a corporation, authority and resources flow down from the top. But in a community, resources and authority flows up from the bottom. It's lowerarchical. And the primary obligation is to its members, those who participate in it. But it also has obligations to all those it affects, namely its stakeholders. Now, the objective of development is an increase in competence, the ability to satisfy your needs and desires and the legitimate needs and desires of others. Now, what's meant by the legitimate needs and desires of others? A legitimate need or desire is one the satisfaction of which does not deprive anybody else of the ability to satisfy their needs or desires. So development doesn't involve enabling somebody to kill somebody else. It only means enabling others to get what they want and need that will not deprive anybody else of that same ability. So the two can occur without each other. And now a point particularly relevant to the interest here. What is the principal index of growth of an organization? It's standard of living. But what's the principal index of growth for a community? Do you talk about the standard of living of Philadelphia versus New York? Well, you could, but that's not what we discuss.
Quality of life.
Quality of life. See, quality of life became the basic standard used to measure development, where standard of living to measure growth. That's why quality became a major issue in the 1980s. As we began to think of corporations as social systems, only began and still just beginning, we began to think of development as a legitimate objective, and the question of measurement comes up, and the answer is, it's not standard of living. In fact, today, we seriously consider reducing standard of living in order to improve quality of life. That's what the environmental movement is all about. It costs money to improve the environment, but we say it's worth it because we place a higher value on quality of life, which is developmental. So the obligation right now is for corporations to begin to understand what development is. Now, growth is a matter of earning. Development is a matter of learning. Development is an increase in competence that comes about through learning. And this has major implications. It says that every corporation must become an educational institution. If it's going to develop its members, it has to enable them to learn. It must itself learn how to do its job better. And so learning becomes a central focus, and suddenly there emerges in the managerial circles, organizational learning is a major topic for discussion. And all kinds of organizations and efforts directed at organizational learning. And we begin to learn something about learning, some of which we're going to look at in a moment. But learning is very different than earning. You can learn a great deal without increasing your earning capacity. You can earn your capacity increase without learning anything. One of the things that shocks us is how stupid the rich people are. And how smart some of the poor people are. Quality of life does not necessarily go with wealth. I sat in the other day with a conversation, people saying, what the hell happens to people in the entertainment industry and sports making all these millions of dollars? They have such a lousy life. They have a much higher than normal commitment of suicide, mental disease, alcoholism, and drug addiction. They have a hell of a high standard of living and a terrible quality of life. Most people say we would sacrifice that standard of living to have sanity and non-addictive behavior. So learning becomes critical. Do you know that corporations spend more money on education than universities and colleges do? They do. In 1996, there was a survey done which showed that all the colleges and universities in the United States put together spent $67 billion on education. They did the same thing in corporations on how much the corporations spend for higher education inside the corporation, not what they send people to. And the answer, if I recall correctly, was 83 billion. Almost a third more than universities and colleges. Unfortunately, it's not any good, but there's a lot of it. And that's the beginning of a recognition that an organization that wants to survive in a dynamic environment has to continually educate its members so they can contain their effectiveness under changing conditions. You know, Peter Drucker also made one other statement that's marvelously insightful. He said, do you know what the principal cause of failure is? Success. Now, what did he mean by that? A successful company thinks it's got it solved, and it becomes static, and that will destroy it. It's non-adaptive to change. He says if you look at the corporations that go out of existence, they're almost all corporations that were successful, but they wouldn't change with the changing environment. And that's what learning is about, the ability to change. So we want to take a look at education a little later and to see what kind of a role a corporation has with respect to it. But we've begun to go through this transformation of looking at a corporation as a social system with a focus on development and quality of life. It opens an interesting question. What happens here? Well, we can only begin to see. You see, that's the next phase of evolution. We aren't there yet. What happens when we begin to look at a corporation as an ecological system? People have started to talk about that, but we haven't completed this transformation yet. And we've got a long way to go before the development function is fully developed. Okay? Do you have any questions about this? Now, I want to talk a little bit about education, and then I want to come back to organization again. Let's see. I want to move ahead on this thing.
Russ, I do have a question. Why is it that you made the statement that most internal training efforts are not real good?
Because they're about the same as the universities and colleges, and they're no good.
So let's get back to the whole.
You don't get, currently it's estimated, I think I mentioned, 95% of what professionals use, they learned outside of school, not inside. That most of what you learn inside school you have to unlearn. It's a major task of recent graduates. Let me just give you some evidence. You're all statistically oriented. You may not know this, but a few years ago, the American Statistical Association had its 100th anniversary. They conducted a survey called the Delphi technique to identify the 4 statisticians living who have contributed most to contemporary statistics. The Delphi technique is a series of surveys. You run the first survey, you get 50 names back from 15,000 members. Then you run a new survey, you reduce the 50 to 15, and the 15 to 10, the 10 to 5, finally got to 4 after 4 iterations. The 4 speakers were invited to a celebration held in New York City. Not one of the 4 had ever had a course in statistics. Exactly. You cannot think out of the box if you're in it. Einstein. Where was Einstein when he developed relativity theory? Was he a professor of physics in a university? He was a clerk in the where? Actually, it was the customs office. Same thing. He was a clerk in the customs office. He later became a professor because of what he had written in the customs office.
It stated he was a terrible mathematician at the time, right?
All kinds of things. The major contributions even in mathematics don't necessarily come from mathematicians. Architecture is a marvelous example. The United States has only ever produced 3 great architects. I mean really great, recognized internationally. You probably won't know them all except one. Richardson, Sullivan, who was a student of Richardson's, and Frank Lloyd Wright, who was a student of Louis Sullivan's. Richardson, Sullivan, and Wright. All of them, none of them, I should say, got a degree in architecture from a university, because universities didn't start to give degrees until after these men. And they have never produced an architect of the quality or standard of those three. Education is a way of preventing development, as is currently taught.
Could you elaborate just a little bit more on that statement you said? You cannot think out of the box when you're in the box. How do you know when you're out of the box?
Oh boy, that's a qualitative thing that you know damn well. Everybody in the box is looking at you as though you're nutty. What the hell are you doing? You know, what do you know about it? You're not an expert.
Challenging you, right?
Right. There's a marvelous book written by Morris Chaffetz, who's a doctor. It's written about medicine. It's called The Tyranny of Experts, in which he shows you that almost uniformly on every medical decision affecting society, the experts are wrong. One after the other. Well, you know this. You know, aspirin was once deadly, and now it's the savior of life. Saccharin would kill you, and now it's perfectly okay. The latest one, which I'm very thankful for, chocolate is good for you. That's a recent one.
I'm happy about the wine.
Yeah, well, you know, these things are, and he shows that the experts in medicine are absolutely awful, and particularly with regard to alcoholism. They treat alcoholism as a disease, and it isn't a disease. We know a lot about alcoholism. The highest rate of cure of alcoholism that doctors have ever obtained is 17%, and there are very few that have attained that level. It's not a medical problem, but they insist on treating it medically. But the people who are making progress with alcoholism are outside of medicine because they're treating it in a very different way than doctors do. Okay? Now, the same thing is true with drug addiction and other kinds of ailments. The principal creative thoughts in almost any area come from people outside of it. Now, let's go back to education for a moment. You know, it's outrageous to say education is a complete failure. As I told you, the United States is the only country in the world with an increasing rate of illiteracy. We are. Our educational system is terrible. Why? Because we have a belief which is absolutely false, that an effective way to learn something is to have it taught to you. That's false. Being taught is one of the worst possible ways to learn anything. Now, anybody who has ever taught knows that, but we don't act on it. How many of you have ever taught a course? Great. Who learned the most in your class? Of course, the teacher, not the students. See, schools are completely upside down. If the students want to learn, what should they be doing? Teaching. That's the way you learn, not being taught. Then what should the faculty be doing? Well, I had a student teach me what a faculty ought to do, because faculty aren't smart enough to teach me. The student stopped me in the hall one day and he said, "Professor, when did you start teaching?" I said, "September 1941. "Wow," he said. "That's a long time." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What's the last time you taught a course on a subject which existed when you were a student?" That's a wonderful question. I never thought of it before. So I had to rummage through my mind what I taught at Penn and at Case and at Wayne. And finally, I settled on September of 1951. I started to teach subjects that I had never heard of when I was a student. He said, "Wow. You mean to say," he said to me, "that everything you've taught since 1951 was something you had to learn that was not taught to you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Boy," he said, "you must be a pretty good learner." Well, I modestly agreed. He said, "What a shame you're not that good a teacher." See, he had it absolutely right. What can a teacher do? A teacher can learn. And therefore, the faculty ought to be a resource available to students who are teaching to give them the backup and the support that they require to learn effectively. Look, we ran experiments you wouldn't believe. 7-year-old kids. We gave them the job of teaching a computer arithmetic. Not to be taught arithmetic by a computer, which is stupid computer-assisted instruction. Think of what happens to the ego of a kid when a machine is teaching him. But give the kid the responsibility of teaching the machine, and he covered 2 years of arithmetic in 1 semester. There are all kinds of experiments of that sort. I was telling some of my friends here that I was incredibly lucky in graduate school. I was drafted in the middle of my first semester of graduate school, and I was an assistant instructor in a department. I was lucky to have made the friendship of the department chairman. He was just a few years older than me, and he became a very close friend, Wes Churchman. And I used all my spare time during the 4 years I was in the military, even abroad, in reading what I would have to be reading if I were back in school. It kept me busy and out of trouble. The result was that when I came back to the university in 1946, I had read almost all the reading required by all the courses I was required to take. So the graduate chairman, John Adams, called me in one day. He said, "You're an embarrassment to the department." He said, "The trouble is you've read more widely in the subjects you have to take than most of the faculty have. We'll make a deal with you. You teach the courses you're supposed to take and we'll give you credit for it." And that's the way I went through graduate school. And boy, I got an education. Because I had to teach subjects I never had. I had to teach logic. I'd never had a course in logic. Or a course in Plato and Aristotle. I didn't know what the hell they were. I had to learn that they were Greeks. And so on. It's through teaching that we learn the most, not by being taught. Now, teaching is only one way of learning. There are a lot of others as well. The educational system is upside down because it's dedicated to teaching. There are 2 things about that. I'll tell you, on the faculty of Wharton School, must appoint a representative to the College of Engineering or a 2-year term. This is for so-called interdisciplinary goodwill. And I got elected 1 year for this task. I resisted, but they insisted. So for 2 years, I had to sit through a monthly faculty meeting in the College of Engineering. And having nothing else to do, I kept a record of what they talked about. In 2 years, the word student was only mentioned once. See? It's a big shock. Universities are not about the education of students. They're not, that's not their purpose. It ought to be, but it's not. What is the principal function of a university? Tenure. It's not tenure, but it's close. It's to provide the faculty with a quality of work life that they want. If you listen to the faculty meetings, it's all about scheduling, about benefits, about schedules and time of classes. It's all about the benefits to the faculty. Teaching is the price the faculty has to pay. And like any price, what do you try to do to it? Minimize it. So the faculty devotes its effort to minimizing teaching. Now you can see that by looking at the rank of professors. The higher the rank, the less teaching. Because the higher the rank, the more control you have. But there's even a better indicator. If you take the ranking of universities and colleges in the United States and go from whatever you want to, Princeton and Harvard up at the top and move all the way down to Topeka State Teachers College, and then put the average amount of teaching hours per semester for each of these colleges, an incredible correlation appears. What is it? The better the university, the less teaching is done. Now, they never carry this to the obvious extreme, which is the ideal university would be one in which there's no teaching done. No teaching of the students would be doing the teaching. By the way, there is one such university in Denmark, but there's none in this country, although there are parts of universities which are now experimenting with this concept of having the students do the teaching and the faculty serve as resources. There's a marvelous elementary school that operates on this principle, starting with kids 5 years old. And if you're interested in education, I would strongly suggest you look up the Sudbury Valley School, which is in Framingham, Massachusetts. Sudbury, S-U-D-B-U-R-Y, Sudbury Valley. It was created and run by Daniel Greenberg. Daniel Greenberg was a professor of physics at Columbia University who married and had a child and became fascinated with the educational problem of his child and decided the educational system to which the child was subjected was destroying him. So he decided he would create a school in which his kid could be educated properly. The result was the Sudbury Valley School. It's a private school.
In what state?
Massachusetts, Framingham, Massachusetts. 60 Minutes did a section on it about 6 months ago. People don't believe it. There are no classes, there are no teachers, and no lectures. The students play all day long. The answer is, well, how will they learn anything? Well, what Greenberg had noticed is that the most intense period of learning in a person's life is 2 to 5 years old. Quantitatively, you learn more things that you use in later life in that 3-year period than you do in any corresponding period in life. Why? He said, because that's when you play. The most effective way of learning is through play. And so he said, I'm going to organize a school in which learning takes place through play. That will be self-determining by the student. This school is incredible. The students elect the faculty who don't teach but are resources. They elect the principal of the school. There are no, it's unbelievable. You see these kids around doing all kinds of crazy things, but none of them doing what you would expect in a school, but they come out well educated, which is something that doesn't happen in normal schools. They're all, unfortunately, education is a subject which I happen to be interested. I'm sure you can't tell that, but I've been involved in all kinds of problems that arise from the deficiencies of the current system. Let me just tell of one that I spoke to you about the other day. This ghetto that's just north of the University of Pennsylvania has a school system which is very bad, had. And Herman Rice, a leader, came to me one day, and he said, our kids are coming out of school, even high school, functionally illiterate. We got to do something about it, because they can't get a decent job. The first thing that happens is when a kid coming out of high school goes for a job, is they look at his color and they give him a reading test, and he winds up doing janitorial work. We've got to do something about literacy. I said, well, that's a good idea, but why don't you get the Board of Education? They got a whole department devoted to illiteracy. He said, we did. We've had 6 different crews from the Board of Education come out, look at our schools, prescribe programs. We've used them all, and they don't have any effect. He said, that's why we asked you. I said, why'd you ask me? He said, you don't know anything. Out of the box. You're not an educator, and therefore you look at the problem separately. So we did. The first thing we said to ourselves, we know those kids because we've been working with them. And if you start with the assumption that the kids in an urban black ghetto are stupid, you're stupid. They are smart as hell. Therefore, the problem is not intelligence, it is motivation. That's a very different question, because I got to motivate kids, that's very different than teaching them. So the next question is, why aren't they motivated? Well, we did some research and we discovered 2 things which were absolutely revealing. First, 65% of the kids that entered school came from homes that did not contain a single book. They had never been read to until the time they entered school. Now, can you imagine a child, never seen a book, really, never been read to, comes to school, and a blonde white teacher says reading is the most important thing in the world. How do they reply? With 2 words. Why should they suddenly think that this is important? The fact is that that culture is oral, not literary. And that's what they know how to do, is talk. That's where rap came from, which is professionalized talk. The second thing is that when those kids, boys, reach 12 years of age, they're compelled to join a gang. Because if they don't join a gang, and if they're not protected by others of their roughly age group, they cannot move through the neighborhood. The neighborhood is divided into turfs, which are areas claimed by a gang, And you can't go into another gang's territory without protection because you will be physically attacked. So you have to join a gang. And if you carry a book, you will be physically attacked. Because I remember one kid saying to me, a book? That's Whitey's thing. Now, given that situation, how the hell do you produce literacy? Well, as I said, it's a problem of motivation. We went to a friend of ours, Julius Rosenwald, who's the son of Lessing Rosenwald, who founded Sears and Roebuck. Julius happens to live in Philadelphia, and he works pro bono for the University of Pennsylvania. What they did first, it was interesting to watch. They would get the older classmen who could read a little bit to come with them and read to them. But after a couple times, the older classmen would say, the hell with this. This is a waste of my time. Why don't you learn how to read? And so peer pressure began, and nobody taught them, but they began to learn how to read, out of watching Charlie Chaplin films. It was a problem of motivation. Following that, we got rid of all the textbooks. Textbooks were terrible because it had no relevance to the culture in which they were raised. It turned out the most effective textbooks were sports almanacs. Oh boy, did they work well, because that's what they loved to read, about basketball records and who was playing basketball and what they did and things of this thing that were relevant to them. So education is really an area that's all mixed up. And it's mixed up because we keep trying to do the wrong things better instead of trying to do the right things better. And as I have written so many times, the righter you do the wrong thing, the wronger you become. And so our education system keeps getting worse because teaching keeps getting better. Since teaching is the wrong thing, the better it becomes, the worse education becomes. And it's very hard for people to accept it. Who are the principal obstructors to fundamental change in education? Teachers. Teachers. The teachers' union just obstructs every effort to change teaching in any fundamental way. For many years, I was a member of the American Federation of Teachers trying to change things, and I finally gave up. It's not possible. Their primary function is to keep things as they are, maintain the economic security of teachers, doing the wrong thing, but continuing to do it with equanimity.
So how's it gonna change? How's it gonna change?
Revolution. You're only going to be able to change the system through revolution. That doesn't mean, I'm not talking about society's revolution, I'm talking about a revolution in education. It will change when enough schools have enough teachers who are adventurous and risk takers to change the educational process so that their success becomes the standard rather than the performance of existing schools.
Their vision will have to change. Their vision will have to change.
Of course it does. The problem with education is that it's been given the function in society of maintaining the status quo. And that's the real problem. We've got to change that. There are designs of educational systems which are out there now that are beginning to get some attention. Unfortunately, they're being terribly distorted. There's not time to go into the voucher system, but the original concept of vouchers, as developed by Christopher Jenks of Harvard, is entirely different from the one promoted by the government. And all the faults that the current one has and are being criticized don't appear in the original proposal. But the way of people who don't want to change, of attacking Jenks's concept, is to caricature it and then show how ridiculous it is. You see, the most effective process against change is if I take you and draw a caricature of you, and then point to the caricature and say, boy, you're funny looking, and take that as reality, instead of looking at you. Well, you may be funny looking too, but you're not as funny looking as the caricature is. Misrepresentation of the program. Any other questions?
Did you pass all the courses that you taught at your graduate level?
I'm sorry?
Did you pass all the courses that you taught at the graduate level?
You damn right I did. I managed to get an A in every one of them. I worked hard, you know.
I'm just wondering if you have an opinion on the Chugash School District. They won the Baldrige Award last year.
No, but I have an opinion on the Baldrige Award. No, I don't know that district, but there are all sorts of marvelous examples. One of the best ones is the Sutcliffe School in Alaska. Incredible high school. You know that one?
That's Chugash.
Sit, yeah, the one where the kids,
The you guys school district.
yeah, oh, that's the one where the kids created the salmon industry.
Yes.
I've met those kids. They're absolutely incredible. They're wonderful. There are schools that have done that kind of thing. The Oak Lane Day School had a teacher, Mary Reese, who, well, as a result of some interaction with us, had the second grade teach the first grade. The third grade taught the second. Fourth grade taught the third. They spent a half a day teaching the grade below them and a half a day being taught by the grade above. That's the way the whole school worked. Incredible results. It's very close to the one-room school concept, except it was a large school. There are lots of other experiments of this sort. The terrible thing is not the number of experiments, it's the failure of the system to adapt them, because the bulk of the system is so static and self-preserving, right? Yeah.
What do you suggest for those people who are different and are trying to revolutionize the system that they're in and they face so much resistance?
They get in continuous trouble. And I talk from personal experience. I mentioned yesterday, I have had the pleasure of being kicked out of 4 universities at various times because of changes I wanted to engage in. And the longest stretch I had was at Penn. But they finally got a dean who got after me, and I got tired of waiting, and I got out. But it's a continuous battle. It's continuous. And the worst thing can happen is you succeed. We created a department without courses, without curriculum, without grades, without examinations, and no admission requirements. Our graduates got the largest number of job offers of any department at university, 21 job offers each. They went out at the highest salaries of any graduates of the University of Pennsylvania. We had more foreign visitors than any other department in the university, but they wanted to get rid of us. Why? Because we broke the rules and succeeded. You see, if you fail, you're no threat. But if you succeed and break the rules, then you're a hell of a threat. Why? Because students in other departments kept asking the other departments, why aren't you doing what they're doing? And so the pressure that builds up to make you conform becomes impossible and unbearable. Yeah.
Your views you're espousing right now in a book, and can you comment on the homeschool movement in the country right now?
No, I haven't commented on that. I know a number of people that are engaged in it. The jury is out on that. It is clear that you can increase the learning of children in homeschool education in many cases in a restricted area, but it's also true that it does lead to underdevelopment in some other important socializing areas. And the jury's not out on that yet. I know a group of parents who are engaged in that, and right now they've gone to an interesting solution. Half a day at home and half a day at school.
That's what it's evolving.
Oh, is that? Yeah.
It's evolving where they get together, the homeschoolers actually get together, go on field trips, and even attend or part of an athletic team at an established school.
That's one effort. The other one is they actually go to a school. In Philadelphia, they go to a friend's school in the afternoon, but work at home separately with their parents in the morning. So it's and we don't know yet how that's going to turn out. Right.
Your second part, I think, just was, you had some references, either yours or others, that you have for this particular model.
Yeah, well, it appears several places. The best place is in press right now. It will be out in the early part of the summer. It's a book published by Stanford University Press. It's a very modest book. It's called Redesigning Society. Okay, and it's jointly authored by me and Sheldon Rovin, R-O-V-I-N. And it has a large section in there on a redesign of the educational system. There's an earlier version of that in a book that came out in the 1970s called Redesigning the Future. I think you've got that one. There was a chapter on education in there which dealt primarily with lower school education. And that has a lot of the stuff in there as well. That's readily available. And that was a book I authored called Redesigning the Future. There are lots of references in there to others who have done a lot of work on educational processes.
I just might add a point in. When we did this yesterday on the panel, I had the unique experience of going on the internet when I knew I was going to get together with Dr. Ackoff. So I just went in and typed in my Google thing and hit Russell Ackoff. And I got 1,890 responses. So if you want to follow some of this, let me suggest that the internet's a great way to do it. He's got a lot of stuff there, and you'll see an incredible wide range of stuff. All these books are there. There are numerous places to get them, and you'll really get a feel not only for what he's saying, but the person and what's out there. There's a tremendous amount there.
Let me just introduce, before we take a break, the next aspect of education I want to talk about for a minute. Start with a couple obvious aphorisms. You never learn by doing something right, because you already know how to do it. All you do is get confirmation of what you already know. You can only learn by identifying mistakes and correcting them. Third position. Throughout school, you are taught that making a mistake is a bad thing. When you get to a corporation, what does the corporation tell you? Making a mistake is a bad thing. Now, if you succeeded in concealing all mistakes, you would succeed in preventing any learning. Now, the question is, what do we do to get around that? Well, when we come back, we'll take a look at the role of mistakes in learning and what corporations ought to be doing about it. Okay? Let's take a break. I want to make I want to discuss two more topics briefly, and then spend the remainder time where you can raise issues and questions and objections so we can have some discussion. For me, that's much more interesting than what I'm doing now, because I've heard all this before. But you have to say things that I haven't, so we'll turn to that pretty quickly. First, I want to come back to mistakes. There are two kinds of mistakes. One is when you do something you should not have done. That's called an error of commission. The other is when you didn't do something you should have done. That's an error of omission. Now, corporations, like people, make both types of errors. Picking up on a company we discussed at lunch, take Eastman Kodak. When Eastman Kodak bought Sterling Drug, they did something they should not have done. That was an error of commission. They later had to sell it and write off a tremendous loss in billions of dollars. When Eastman Kodak did not buy Fuji, and when it did not buy Xerox, there were errors of omission, things they didn't do. Now, first question is, which of the two types of errors is more important? If you look at companies that fail or are having difficulty, is it because of what they did or because of what they didn't do? Didn't do. Errors of omission are much more important than errors of commission. If you look at IBM in the 1980s, when it got into very serious trouble, damn near went bankrupt if Gerstner hadn't pulled it out. What did IBM do wrong? It didn't do anything wrong. It's what it didn't do. What didn't it do?
It moved to smaller machines.
It didn't pay any attention to the smaller machines, right. Eastman Kodak paid no attention to digital photography and got in trouble. Sears paid no attention to Walmart and got into trouble. Now, the accounting system that we use in the Western world will record only one of those two types of error. Which one? If you do something wrong, it will show up. If you buy Sterling Drug, it'll eventually appear in the books. But what happens if you don't buy Xerox? It never appears in the books. Now, here is a manager in a corporation in which only one of the two types of mistakes can be recorded, namely doing something you shouldn't have done, and in which it is said that making a mistake is a bad thing, like school. Then if you want to maximize your security, you must try to minimize errors of commission. You don't worry about errors of omission because they're not recorded. How do you minimize errors of commission? Don't do anything. Exactly. People keep saying, why don't organizations change? That's why they don't change. For that combination of reasons. The serious errors are errors of omission. These are not recorded. The errors that are recorded are errors of commission. The company takes a position against making mistakes, and therefore the strategy for maximizing job security is do as little as you can possibly get away with. And that's why organizations don't change. And if we're going to produce a dynamic industrial and enterprise and economy, we have to change the attitude towards mistakes and produce fundamental changes in the accounting system. There are individuals who are trying to do this, but they still have an uphill battle to go. So education is going to have to change. Just think, mistakes are a way of learning. Now suppose we really were interested in learning in school. You give an examination out and it comes back and your 10 questions you did wrong. They're marked with an X. Now if I was really interested in learning, I would give that examination back to you in a week and see how many errors you would then make. How much had you learned from the mistakes which you previously made? But see, examinations aren't about learning at all. They're about grading. Grading is for the faculty, not for the students. If we use examinations for learning, they'd be entirely different than they are now. Okay? Any questions about mistakes? Yeah.
Just a short question about the recent shuttle event. As we search for the mistake, what's your feelings on how that process is going at a public level or just out there?
Oh, you mean, you're talking about 9/11?
No, I'm talking about the shuttle Columbia.
Oh, the Columbia, about what mistake was made.
Well, no, just search for error. You think we're treating that the same way you just described we treat some kind of mistake?
Yeah, fundamentally, we're looking for what we did that was wrong, rather than what we didn't do that would have been right. Yeah. That will come later when we say, what should we have done to avoid this kind of errors in the future? And that will turn to what we should do that we didn't do before. So in a case like that, we might eventually become rational. Yeah. I've been asked to comment about downsizing because yesterday I made some very disparaging remarks about it. The trouble with downsizing is it doesn't work. It's a complete failure. That doesn't stop people from doing it. It doesn't stop Boeing from doing it. But it doesn't work. And that's not my word. That's the Wall Street Journal's word. Wall Street Journal did a study of corporations that had done major downsizing 2 years after the downsizing. And overwhelmingly, costs were higher at the end of 2 years than they were before the downsizing began. It doesn't work. And we know why. Because most companies, in a so-called effort to be humane, either use attrition or the golden handshake, or some version, golden parachute, whatever you call it. Now, when you give people an option of retiring under very attractive conditions or staying, which people will take the option of leaving? The most competent. Why? Because they feel they have the best chance of getting a job other than the one they're leaving. So there's a tremendous drain of competence from the organization, which it then discovers it has to make up for. How does it do that? Usually through consultants, who cost 1.5 to 2 times more than the original person did, and so costs go up. But what's much worse is what it does to morale. I mean, I've seen them stuff in morale you wouldn't believe. I was working in Alcoa, and I went to visit a factory once that had just gone through a downsizing and had announced there would be another one. In the factory, there was a huge wall of supplies ready to be fed into the production line. And the wall was about 8 feet high. And I happened to go around behind it, and there were about 11 people sitting in there playing cards. They were hiding. So I sat down and talked to them, and I said, look, this is off the record, but what are you doing here? They said, hiding. I said, why? He said, well, they don't see us, they won't fire us. Now, physically, people don't necessarily have to hide. The fact is, they try to make themselves inconspicuous, one way or the other. And the way you do that is not by doing anything. So again, downsizing discourages activity. It also overloads people who are there, and it removes very, very essential competence. The best thing about what can be done is you don't have to downsize if you have extra people. There is a constructive alternative. But that alternative requires management to do something it doesn't know how to do. Think. We're in your domain now. You think I'm kidding, so let me give you a couple of examples. The Clark Equipment Corporation was on the verge of bankruptcy in the early 1980s. Clark Equipment makes forklift trucks. They invented the forklift truck. They make small tractors, small road building equipment. They were in very serious trouble because of the Japanese invasion of the American market, particularly a company called Komatsu. They were so close to bankruptcy that the board, in typical fashion, said, who's to blame for this damn mess? And so the answer was the CEO. It has to be his fault, so they fired him. Now they had to hire a new one very quickly. And because they had to do it quickly, they made a serious mistake. They hired a good one. They hired the president of General Motors Canada, who wanted to return to the United States. He didn't like the job in Canada. And he was a native of the area around Buchanan, Michigan, where Clark Equipment Corporation was headquartered, right outside of South Bend, Indiana. It's a suburb of South Bend. His name was Jim Reinhardt. Now, Jim Reinhardt came down. He was an old friend. And one of the things he did was make an immediate systems analysis, identified each component of the system that constitutes Clark, and did a cost analysis of its operations. He made an important discovery within the first couple of weeks. He was paying much too much for transportation. He had a transportation department which had 150 truck trailers that hauled heavy construction equipment around the country to distributors from the factory. And he had 450 employees in that company, in that division. He quickly found out that if he used commercial carriers, he could save more than $20 million a year, just like that, bang. Now, he couldn't afford not to save $20 million a year. He called a meeting of the transportation department, which I was lucky enough to attend. And here's the way it went. He said, gentlemen, in order for this company to survive, I must reduce costs. I don't have an alternative. You are an obvious candidate. Why? Because if I were to use commercial carriers, I could save $20 million a year. And that's not your fault. He said the reason is the commercial carrier is organized by the Teamsters Union. And their salaries, hourly pay, is less than ours, which is a technical union. I have to let you go. He said, unfortunately, that's going to cost me a lot of money. He said, I have certain obligations to you which I must fulfill when I lay you off. He said, it turns out to be this amount of money per person. He put it up on the board. He multiplied it by 450, and it was a big number in the millions. He said, I looked at that number, and an idea occurred to me. It's almost enough for you to buy the transportation department. but it's not enough. He said, I wouldn't sell it for that amount. So I went to the banks in South Bend, he said, and I asked them, if I were to put up this amount of money, which was 450 times the benefits he owed them, how much will you lend me to buy the transportation department? And they offered me this amount of money. If I add the two together, he said, that's enough for you to buy the transportation department lock, stock, and barrel. And if you decide to buy it, I will give you a contract to carry all of our equipment for 2 years, providing you give me the same cost as other commercial carriers. They took it. Nobody lost their job. Today, it is the largest trucking company in the north central part of the United States. All because the CEO felt an obligation to maintain employment. Okay? Not necessarily in the company, but as a community with an obligation to its members. If people have to move out, you have to worry about where they're going to move to. Had a similar problem with General Electric. General Electric used to make welding equipment. It was number 2, but a very small number 2. The welding equipment business is dominated by a company in Cleveland called Lincoln Electric. Some of you may know Lincoln Electric. It has over 80% of the market. GE had only 9% of the welding equipment, and it was number 2. It kept trying to get a bigger share, and it couldn't. So they finally got a strategy. We're going to build a completely automated plant, as automated as possible, very few people, to build welding equipment. So we get the cost of the equipment way down, and we're going to compete with Lincoln on price and make the price difference so great that loyal customers of Lincoln will have to switch over to our equipment. So they built a new plant in York, Pennsylvania. It was automated to beat hell. They started to produce the equipment very efficiently at a much lower price, put it out on the market, and it had absolutely no effect on market share. The company was terribly disappointed and invested a lot of money and got no return from it. They came to Wharton and said, would you do a study to determine whether we ought to stay in the welding business or not? And we did. We took on the study. The answer was clear. No, get the hell out. But you got a problem. You got a brand new plant you just built, completely automated. And what you do about that plant is a part of the decision to get out of the business. You can't separate it because there's a relationship between the two. So after discussion, General Electric put the plant up for sale at a price that was significantly less than what it was worth. I mean, way down, with a condition. The condition was, if you buy the plant at this price, you must keep the workforce. Within 2 months, they got a buyer. They bought the plant and kept the workforce. And General Electric had a net gain. Now, can you figure out how?
The benefits of the employees.
Exactly. They didn't have to pay any benefits to the employees. They transferred directly over to the new employer, who assumed all the benefit responsibilities. And General Electric was absolved of all of that, and that was a larger amount than what they lost on the sale of the plant. So they came out with a net gain. Again, it's because somebody thought about the responsibility of maintaining employment. I have never seen a case, and I can give you 50 of them, where companies were confronted with the need to reduce employment, but who, instead of just laying people off, which is easy and normally harmful, they try to think it out, how it can benefit both the company and the employees. I want to give you one other case. This also involved Clark. This is Clark after it got to be pretty robust. Clark had, like most companies that make heavy equipment, a credit company. You know, General Electric has a credit company, GMAC, which makes trucks and also issues credit. As you probably know, General Electric, which is the fastest and the largest growing corporation in the world now, is primarily that size because of credit. It's the GE credit company that's responsible for most of the growth of General Electric. Well, Clark had a credit company which financed its bulldozers and the heavy equipment so that people didn't buy this equipment in the normal sense. They would buy it the way most people buy an automobile, on time. and the time would be financed by the credit company. Now the credit company was running into trouble. The reason was that Clark was a very poor credit risk when it was close to bankruptcy. And so it had gone down from a AA rating all the way down to where its credit wasn't worth a damn. Clark made a deal and divested the credit company, set it up as a separate corporation in which Clark owned a share. The minute it became a separate corporation, its credit rating changed. It became much better than Clark's, which meant that they could now finance Clark's sales at a lower interest rate than they could before. So Clark benefited, and the company survived, which it would not have done had it been forced to compete with a higher rate of interest and competition. So again, trying to think through the implications of layoffs almost always reveals something that can be done that will be to the benefit both of the company and of the people who would otherwise be affected. Do you have any questions?
Russ, is that in all three effects, with the attrition, is that same general statement true? What happens normally when the company try to attrite?
What happens if
What
what?
happens when they try to attrite the people, just let them, whoever goes, goes? Put a hiring freeze on, and through attrition, you let people go out the door, and that's the way you downsize.
What happens, well, what happens, what I've already referred to, what happens is that if you select the people who go, you probably will not select the most competent people. And that will not produce the crisis in competence. But what it does do, it produce a crisis in morale. Because you are making the choice of who goes. And the people who remain are scared to death that you're going to pick them next. And it's their hiding that reduces the productivity and efficiency of operations. In every case that I know of where productivity has been measured after a downsizing, it goes down. And over time, costs go up. There's always an immediate bump, but over time it goes up. Look what happened to Scott Paper. You remember Chainsaw?
Oh, yeah, chainsaw.
What happened to Scott?
Well, he went through about 3 companies before he...
You're damn right. It went out of business, essentially. It was finally acquired by the company that has Kleenex. Then he went to Sunbeam, where he cut like hell. What happened to Sunbeam? You put them out of business, right. The easiest way to put people out of business is to keep reducing the workforce. Right? It does not work. But you're not going to convince management of that because it seems to be a quick and easy fix to which Wall Street always responds incorrectly. Right?
You talked about the cost of laying people off, but you didn't get into the social cost, and that accounting system you're talking about doesn't reflect the social cost back into the cost of the company, because the company's still paying part of the social cost of laying people off.
What do you mean by the social cost?
The welfare, for example. I mean, the unemployment insurance is just one example of things that you got to pay. The lack of money that, as a laid-off person, I can't pay it. I can't go out and buy stuff.
Well, the company's position on that is we are paying for the welfare. Where does the money to pay for welfare come from, except from our taxes? I'm telling you what the position of the company is. They say that's not our responsibility, that's society's responsibility, and we pay society to take care of that. So that's not their worry. The fact is that it's inefficient independently of that cost. It doesn't pay in the long run, because there are alternatives that are better, and there are many of them like that. At Alcoa, it was a case where they had to have a massive layoff. They went from 6,200 to 1,500 hourly paid workers, but with the collaboration of the union. And nobody who wanted to work lost a job. Nobody. All because Dick Ray, the managing director, said, I have an obligation to keep these people employed. And one way or another he did. And some ingenious stuff he did. 6,200 to 1,500. Yeah.
Isn't this all academic if the North Atlantic current reverses in 20 years? And New York freezes over?
Well, it's academic if there's an atomic bomb in every major city in the United States. It's academic if the Ice Age returns again. But I've got more immediate worries. So I don't worry about those things. There's nothing I can do about them. But there's something I can do about downsizing. Any other questions that you have? Yeah.
What about a GE Jack Welch approach where you, like the bottom 10% every year is what do you think about that?
I was not involved with GE after Red Jones left and Jack Welch took over. All I know is what I hear by rumor. He's looked at as a genius. I can tell you the morale of the company was lousy because of the way he treated people. He was not exactly a good people manager. But he did some unusual things. He cut out every business that wasn't first or second in its field. Everybody knows that. He put a tremendous focus on education. So I don't know really the full accounting, but my impression is that the longer he's out of the job, the less glamorous he looks. But I don't know. Yeah.
You mentioned the Wall Street Journal study, and several of the case studies you were just telling us about are pretty widely known. Why does the myth that downsizing is good persist when there's data that says it's not?
It's because it is clear that there's an immediate bump in costs, even with the write-off of expenses of departure. I learned the answer to your question when I made a proposal to August Bush Jr., who died a number of years ago and was CEO of Anheuser-Busch, about a change. And he said to me, how long will it take to implement that change? I said, well, 4 to 5 years. He said, hell, he said, I got to retire in 2 years. Don't worry me about that stuff. Let the next generation worry about that. Let me play it out. Now, when the son came in 1973, as a young man, he was only in his 30s. He now had a long perspective. He did all the things that his father wouldn't do because his father knew he was going to retire. So the principal reason people don't do things is that the damn CEOs are too old. Did you ever read Townsend's Up the Organization? Do you remember what he said? Our CEOs stay in there too damn long, and they become protective of their role, and so they tend to stabilize. They don't want to introduce fundamental change because they don't want to take responsibility for failure. And since things are going pretty good now, let's keep them this way until I get out. Then let them do what they have to do. So it's largely a matter of age. Young executives are much more likely to produce change and look for innovation than older ones are. Yeah.
Earlier you talked about businesses that have successful parts, but as a whole is unsuccessful. And as I look around Boeing, I can see parts of the organization that are successful, and they've done things, new things to create that. But as an organization, we can be a lot more successful. So when you're dealing with an organization the size of Boeing, how do you create the organization as a whole being successful?
Well, you have to do it by the proper organization. Boeing isn't the largest corporation in the world by a long shot. It's not even among the first 25. I mean, it's tiny compared to some organizations, and they can solve the problem. I mean, take a look at a corporation smaller than Boeing. Take a look at Mars Corporation, with which we've done some work. It has physical operations in 42 countries and markets in 147. Now there's complexity for you. One of the things you learn is that everybody's business looks more complicated, looks simpler than theirs does. Benjamin Franklin, in all of his wisdom, had one marvelous aphorism that's very seldom quoted. Familiarity breeds complexity. See? Your job always looks more complicated than the other guys for a good reason. You know your job and you don't know the other person's. but he thinks his job is more complicated than yours. I had a professor that knew the truth, Tom Cowan, when he said everybody's job is more complicated than everybody else's. And that's really true. So the size of Boeing is not the obstruction to its effective organization. It's the concept of organization. Now, I don't know enough about Boeing to be a critic of it, because I haven't worked at that level. I've only worked at the level of commercial aviation in this company. But I wouldn't take it as an unsolvable problem because of size. It's not.
I'm going to remove the word Boeing from my question and make it more general. Okay?
Yeah. Well, it says that, how do you organize? Now, I didn't talk here, but if you look at the tape of yesterday, where I discussed organizational theory as it's affected by systems thinking, you might find some ideas which are not used by Boeing, which would allow Boeing to become a whole. The chances are today Boeing is not a system, it's a network. It's a set of essentially independent businesses that don't interact in any significant way. What they have in common is ownership. That's a holding company, that's not a system. And a holding company is a network. Now again, I don't know enough about, but I would guess from what you're saying that Boeing is a network, it's not a system. If this place were to close down, would it affect other parts of Boeing? I don't know. See, it comes back to the big difference between a network and a system. You can remove a part of the network and it never shuts the network down, it just diverts it. But take a part of a system out, an essential part, and it closes down, period. Okay. If we have time, after you can ask your question, I'll come back and talk about organization a little bit, but let me get your questions or issues first. Yeah.
Do recent trends, being the last couple of years, events and trends of WorldCom, Enron, Adelphia, and whatever, do you see a fundamental shift in management and motivation by senior management based around stock options? Is something different going on now than 10 years ago?
No, it's just reaching a culmination. I don't think it's something different. It's just the accumulation of a movement that's come along. And it's good because it clearly demonstrates the need to make fundamental changes, both in the measurement of performance of corporations and in accounting systems. There's going to have to be some major and fundamental changes in a lot of things in order to prevent this from occurring in the future. You know, there are all kinds of people diagnosing it, all the way from personal greed to imperfections in the system. I talked to a good friend who's a major accountant, and it was great fun because he said, all this fuss about WorldCom and Enron is trivial. He said, the real robbery is occurring legally. He said, the legal use of accounting to avoid taxation makes this stuff look trivial, he said. He said, do you know how many corporations have their banks outside the United States? It's legal. But do you know how much that cheats the United States of? Do you know how the manipulation of profits from one year to another to minimize taxes? And he went on and on and on. He said, we're looking at the wrong things. We have to look at the fundamentals of accounting and change it. Now you put on top of that stupid tax laws, and we get the irrationality of the people. But the stock options is really a major mistake.
Seems to be proven out.
Yeah. Because it changes the motivation of management in a significant way. There's an easy way of changing that. A manager cannot cash in his options until after retirement. It'd be easy to do. It would take care of at least that problem. It wouldn't take care of others, but it would take care of that. Any other questions? No.
Hey, everyone. I was in Beijing last April, and I was in the American Embassy with Dr. Bertolini and 30 other MBA students. When we were there, we were actually being courted by a couple of folks from not only the Embassy there, but from the National Security Council, they're on a number of different issues. Dr. G was one of he was basically he sat opposite Khrushchev's and was part of the National Security Council during the Nixon. But one of the things of interest is they were trying to induce us or let us know how to exploit the emerging market within China. And being familiar with the supply chain and those doing the optimization models for making money and what have you, and working and offloading overseas to increase the margins. In line with your talk about the responsibility of maintaining employment, we have a lot of the erosion of our communities, and I'm wondering what your insight is on in reducing our industrial base and industrialized nation and actually building the infrastructure of some of these other countries. What do you think the impact will be?
Yeah, I think in general our attitude towards this is completely wrong. The major problem in the world is the maldistribution of wealth and opportunity. And when we do something like NAFTA, it makes a minor adjustment. It redistributes wealth a little bit from the wealthy to the poor. And unless we do a hell of a lot more of it, this world is going to become a much bigger mess than it is now, for a simple reason. The tools of mass destruction are becoming rapidly available to the poorest nations. And they're going to use them if they have to get a redistribution of wealth. We're already facing that threat from North Korea. Until we're ready to redistribute wealth in a significant way, we're in trouble. And so when the unions and Ralph Nader say that shipping jobs to Mexico is bad, they're nutty. Because if we don't ship those kind of jobs to poorer countries to raise their standard of living and quality of life, we're in for hell. What we have to do is upgrade the nature of employment in this country that requires the kind of education we can provide that they can. So we have to substitute. There's no reason why we have to use people in this country to do menial labor anymore. The trouble is we're not even equipping people to do mental labor. I was amazed to learn the other day, you know where most of the telemarketing is taking place from?
India.
Yeah. Because there aren't enough people to do that kind of thing here. The same thing is true in a lot of other technical jobs, software, for example. The Israeli economy is built largely on software production. So we have to start to be increasingly willing to transport jobs out of the country, which are low paying, require low skill, but suitable for less developed countries. And that will produce a required redistribution of wealth, at least in part. We are consuming much too much of the world's wealth. There was a marvelous study done at the end of World War II in England. A group of scientists were brought together by Churchill, and they were asked the following question. How much of the current expenditures of developed countries would have to be devoted to less developed countries to elevate the less developed countries to the level of development of the more developed countries within a century? What a fascinating question. The answer was shocking. If 10% of the world's expenditures on military matters were devoted to development, we could do it in 100 years. Only 10%. Okay. This is very feasible. Economically, it's not feasible politically, because we won't devote that amount of money. We are a country that's incredibly self-centered. I had a terrible awakening. I spent some time in India a number of years ago. And India had asked the United States for something very reasonable. We were mothballing the merchant marine that was left over from World War II. These were the merchant ships that we used to carry supplies to the troops both in Asia and in Europe. And there was a huge fleet of what are called the Mariner. These are freighters. And we were mothballing. India wanted to buy them from us. It said that it needed these ships for intercoastal shipping, because India, as you know, is a big peninsula, and the best way to transport between the major cities is by sea. We would not sell to India, and the reason we gave was they would convert those ships into ocean-going vessels and compete with our merchant marine. Now, that was not true, but that's the reason we gave. But we felt guilty. So we offered them something in place of the ships. This was while I was there. We offered them the surplus of our butter. That's literally true. Now, two things are interesting. First, the Indians never used butter. They used ghee, which is something entirely different. Secondly, they didn't have refrigeration. So even if they used butter, they couldn't keep it. Now, when I was there, they kept saying to me, you see, the United States gives us more than any other country in the world, but it's worth less than almost what any other country gives us. Because the other countries give us what we need, but the United States gives us what they want to get rid of. And that's a very important distinction, and we got to get over it. It's what we want for our interest that dictates our foreign policy, not what's good for them. That's one of the reasons we're hated around the world.
I would encourage all of you, if you get the chance, to go on the internet. It's called Russell Ackoff Presentations, A System Approach to Terrorism Conference, July 15, 16, 2002, where he explained this in a lot of detail. Wonderful reading, and exemplifies what he just suggested here. It's available on the internet.
Well, what I'd like to do, we have a little time before we break. Let's take 5 minutes to stretch. And then I want to talk about what we have to do to corporations to produce a fundamental change in the culture of American enterprise. And that is, how do you democratize enterprises, economic enterprises? Okay? Just take a break for 5 minutes. I want to set up a little. I want to answer a question that I'm frequently asked. If you can do only one thing to a corporation, what would you do? Now, that's a very difficult question, because particularly if you think systemically, you tend to think of the interaction of the things you can do rather than any one thing taken separately. But unfortunately, despite that, I've been in a position several times where a corporate executive has said to me, you've got a whole array of things that you say we should do. I only want to do one of them. Which one should I do? And that's what I want to show you, the one I would do. Because it's the one that has the most profound effect on an organization in a relatively short time, and compared to the others is relatively easy to implement. Relatively, not easy. Well, let's take a look at what it is. It's democratization of a corporation, and the issue comes up for a series of characteristics of the current environment. The first one is the raised educational level of the workforce. The workforce in the United States today, on the average, has at least 1 year of college education. In 1900, it had 8 years. In 1850, it had 3 years. It's a continuously, increasingly educated workforce. Now, that has a big implication. If I want to build a building in the Philippines, in one of the primitive islands, or in New Guinea, and I've had to do both, you better know how to build a building, and you better tell the people who are working for you, the Aborigines or the natives, how to do it. I had to build a large club for officers in the Philippines out of bamboo and grass. But the natives had never built a building that was larger than a little tiny hut. And this was a building 40 by 60. And I had little trusses out of bamboo. I had to know how to build a truss and tell them how to do it. But if I want to build a truss in New York City and try to tell carpenters how to frame it, they'll laugh me out of the business. As the educational level of the workforce comes up, the nature of management must change. It must convert from supervision of ignorant subordinates to the management of interactions of intelligent subordinates who can do their job better than I can. See, it's something an architect has to learn early. He can't do carpentry as well as the carpenter, or electrical work as well as the electrician, or plumbing as well as the plumber. What he has to do is manage the interaction between them to get a building in which these things work together effectively. He manages interactions. And that drives you towards democracy for reasons that we'll see. The second thing that happened in my life was an incredible experience I had in Iran before the revolution. We were doing work with a research organization in the government of Iran in the redesign of the Ministry of Health. That research institute, a very large one called the Industrial Management Institute, was headed up by Jamshid Gargadashi. He's now in the States and he's a colleague of mine. We brought him here after the revolution. He met me at the airport on one of my trips and told me that the Shah wanted to see me. That was a surprise because I didn't know the Shah even knew I existed. So I found out why. Jamshid was the principal scientific advisor to the Shah and his wife. I wasn't aware of this. And the Shah had discussed with him a major problem that he had, and Jamshid had suggested I might be able to help, and so the Shah had issued the invitation for me to come to talk to him. So I was eager to accept. I wanted to see what a palace looked like on the inside. Boy, I wish I had time to tell you what I found. It was incredible. The next morning, he and I went to the palace, and we no sooner got through the door than a liveried man received us and took us into a waiting room. It was a beautiful room. We sat there comfortably for a few minutes. And the young man came back and told us that unfortunately the Shah was called off on an emergency, and we could hear the helicopter taking off from the lawn outside. He said, but we'll meet anyhow, but with the Queen, because the Shah has briefed her, and she will discuss with you the problem he wanted to talk about. And as I told the group yesterday, this was a great advantage and improvement because she was prettier than he was. She was a marvelous woman, actually brilliant. She was a graduate architect from the Sorbonne. Her study was unbelievable. It was a room about this size, completely furnished in Louis XV furniture. It was like a museum. A great big fireplace with a fire roaring in it, and tea, and we sat on two tables and two chairs with the table between us facing the fireplace, and for 2.5 hours we discussed the problem that the Shah had. The Shah was the most powerful ruler on earth. Now that's not a figurative statement, that's literally true. Because he was the only head of state that did not report to a constitution, like every other head of state does. The Shah reported directly to God. He was responsible only to God, and therefore the only appeal for a Shah's decision was prayer. There's no legal recourse on a Shah's decision. He was an absolute ruler, more absolute than Louis XIV or any ruler of history. He could walk down the street and say, kill her. And bang, that's it. There's no question. His decision was will. But you know what problem we were asked to discuss? Why couldn't he get any of his programs implemented as he intended?